Today's episode of the Winter Growers Podcast is brought to you by Growing for Market magazine. Which crops will pay back your investment in a hoop house or greenhouse? How does managing a greenhouse through the winter differ from summer growing? And which crops can just be overwintered in the field? Learn all that and more by subscribing to Growing for Market magazine. The writers are farmers, not journalists. They won't tell you how to grow, they'll tell you how they grow, so you can decide what works for your farm. Growing for Market is celebrating 30 years of helping local food and flower growers succeed with articles written by experienced farmers from around North America. Since 1992, Growing for Market is by farmers, for farmers. Plus, subscriptions start at only $30 per year. Whether you do farmers markets, local wholesaling, a CSA, or dream of starting a farm, check them out today at growingformarket.com. Request a free sample print or digital copy from their website, and podcast listeners can get a new subscriber discount of 25% off with the code WINTER when subscribing at growingformarket.com. I think Growing for Market magazine is an excellent and affordable resource for any grower. Today's show is also brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds.
Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud sponsor of the Winter Growers Podcast. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, innovative tools, and pertinent information to help feed their families and communities and ensure their growing success. Our 40-acre research farm is the heart of Johnny's, where we trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Our research team is dedicated to finding solutions to the ever-changing challenges growers face, including disease, environmental or insect pressures, and shifting market trends. We invite you to visit the Growers Library at johnnyseeds.com to find technical resources like the Winter Growing Guide, which has tips on planting and harvesting into the shortest days of the year. You can also find variety comparison charts, extensive Jang roller trial results, and more. The employee owners at Johnny's are working hard to make 2022 a great year, and we look forward to growing with you.
Welcome to the Winter Growers Podcast. So today, I am so very excited to announce my guest, my dad, Eliot Coleman. When I conceptualized this show, I had always hoped to have him as one of the guests. I was really interested and wanting to share with all of you the last 53 years of four-season farming that he's experienced. So we talk about everything from where he started, his first aha moments, those successes, those failures, the trials, the errors, how he ended up back here at Four Season Farm, how I ended up here, and everything else in between. So this is a really special conversation, and I'm so excited to share it with you. Also, when this episode launches on December 15th, it is also Elliot's 83rd birthday. So a big happy birthday to my dad, and I'm so grateful for everything that he's given to both me, my family, and to this larger farming community. Okay, well, welcome to the show. It's so nice to have you. Today, my guest is my dear dad, Eliot Coleman. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
I'm happy to be here, Clara.
Well, good. Well, when I first conceptualized this podcast, I had always had it in the back of my mind that you should definitely be on this show. And I really loved sort of the idea of looking at, the last 53 years of your farming career and how four-season farming has really become an integral component of your career. And I thought it would be really interesting for listeners to sort of hear, directly from you how you started with it, where it's gone, where you think it might go, and really just sort of like delve into your process and your evolution with four-season farming. So it's really, really, I think, exciting to have you and to talk about that part of farming. So I love to get started with all my guests with talking about your background. Most people are very familiar with your background, but I think it's always interesting to hear from your words. Like what was that aha moment for you with farming and starting off on this crazy adventure?
Oh, well, the aha moment was reading Scott and Helen Nearing's Living the Good Life. And basically, it said, this sounds crazy, but it's going to be a heck of an adventure, and you're going to enjoy it. And basically, I was an adventurer. I had a teaching job at the moment. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if there was something more socially redeeming in my future than the next mountain? And I said, okay, let's go see if we can't create a farm out of nothing and grow food and feed people.
So where were you when you first came across their books?
I was teaching at a small college in New Hampshire. And once I got inspired, I taught there 2 more years, and I was able to rent a piece of land with a cabin on it from the college, and that was where I first started growing. And I'd come and visited the Nearing. They had this wonderful stone wall greenhouse, and of course I didn't have the time to build a stone wall greenhouse, but I did build a stone wall with a cold frame leaning up against it, and that worked really well.
Yeah. So you were with, this is where you met my mom,
Yep.
Sue, in New Hampshire. And were you growing anything just through the summer season? What was sort of like, how did you first play around with getting into growing things?
Well, we had that cold frame up against the stone wall. And so one fall, I put some kale in there. 2 types of kale, regular kale and Siberian kale. And it was fascinating because mice or voles or something like that got in there and they ate only the regular kale. They didn't eat the Siberian kale. And I thought, oh, I wonder if they're telling me that the regular kale tastes better or if the Siberian kale in the middle of the winter isn't as good. It turned out that I was glad they hadn't eaten the Siberian kale because it was hardier and it was the one that was most likely to give us a few leaves to eat in the winter. But that was sort of the first curiosity. Oh, okay, I wonder if we can do this moment.
And so wait, was that in New Hampshire?
That was in New Hampshire.
And what year was that?
Oh, that would have been 1966.
Okay, so many, many, many moons ago.
Yeah.
And so would you say, in addition to sort of experimenting with growing and farming, that was kind of your first moment with seeing how you can push the envelope with growing things in the cold months?
Well, yes. When we moved over here, we did have a small cold frame here, and we built a simple little pit greenhouse against the front south wall of our house. And we were able to overwinter parsley and I think I transplanted leeks in there once and stuff just to see what would happen with stuff that, wouldn't it be nice if we could have it? Since we had no electricity, so we had no freezer, if there were going to be fresh food, we had to sort of invent it. And then, since I have a passion for books, I was reading all sorts of English books about what Europeans were doing with glass to protect crops and change climate in the middle of the winter. And I got fascinated by a system that the British called Dutch lights. It was a system in the Netherlands of using large panes of glass in a wooden frame that were either on low supports like cold frames, or they actually built 2x4 frames, and then they could take these same panes of glass and attach them to the 2x4 frame and create a greenhouse they could walk into. And so when I took a job running an organic experimental farm in Massachusetts for a couple of years, we actually got a government grant to build a Dutch light system and experiment with that. And we did everything the books had suggested. And so we had the wooden frame that we could put the glass panels on, the extra glass panels on in the winter, as well as low cold frames. And we found that was where we first learned about some of these ideas. We planted carrots the about the first week in August, and then we put the cold frames over them, filled the cold frames above the carrots with straw for extra insulation. And I have a picture in one of my slideshows of us harvesting carrots out of that on the 3rd of February. And we were experimenting around with not only growing stuff, but interesting ways to market it. And long before the present huge health food store, there was a small operation down there called Bread and Circus. And so we packaged up all these carrots, called them, asked if they'd be interested in some locally harvested midwinter carrots. And they said yes, and we took them down one morning. And later that afternoon, they called and they said, we'd like another 16 shipments, please. Those are the best tasting carrots we ever eaten. And we had to advise them this was just an experiment and we weren't going to be able to do that. But that was the first indication. And this was just with cold frames. And then as we harvested the carrots, we had seedlings of lettuce that we put in there, and they could come in extra early. And at about the time in, let's say, late April, when we were harvesting the lettuce, we'd transplanted in little cucumber seedlings, and we found, isn't this amazing what we can do with just cold frames? The disadvantage, of course, was whenever it snowed, we had to shovel them off and brush the snow off, but still, this was in Massachusetts and it was pretty good. So the second winter, we did a trial in the small greenhouse that we had created by putting these glass panes on the 2x4 frame. And we put a cold frame inside there. And all of a sudden, this was when the little light bulb went off above my head in the cartoon pictures. This was the great leap forward. We said, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We can... we realized we couldn't do tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, but we can do almost anything once we get into double coverage. And that was really the beginning of it all. And I left that job to take a job running a farm for a school in Vermont. And I took all the frames with me because the farm in Massachusetts didn't want them anymore. And we found we could do it in Vermont. Just as well. So when I moved back here in 1990, we brought those with us and started playing around here to see whether we could make it commercial. And you were part of some of those early experiments. And I could remember I would come in from the experimental garden and I would harvest stuff in the middle of February. And I'd come into the kitchen and you and your sister and brother were there. And I'd be saying, wow, you wouldn't believe what's out there. And everybody say, sure, we've all heard it all before. Shut up and make the vinaigrette. But it was just, I was stunned daily what we were learning and how it was... there was hardly anything that we tried that we didn't succeed at to some extent. And there were crops that would get more beat up in winter than others. And with them, we would try things like putting an extra layer of bubble plastic in the cold frame inside the greenhouse on especially cold nights. And that made a difference. And then we continued researching this. And obviously, if 2 layers of covering were good, why wouldn't we want to go to layer 3 and layer 4? But as we researched that in the greenhouse literature, it was obvious that each layer of protection, either glass or plastic, cut out an additional 10% of the light. So we had probably pushed the layers as far as we could, but then there was always the potential of putting on another layer at night. So heated greenhouses use a reflective material that they draw over the inside of the greenhouse at night to keep the heat in, and then it's automatically rolled up and withdrawn in the morning. And so we bought huge sheets of that. And Barbara and I would go out every afternoon about 3 o'clock and stretch it over all the crops under the inner layer in the greenhouse. By that point, we'd gotten rid of the cold frames because they required too much work, and we just had fabric in there at night. And then the next morning at 7, we'd be out there and rolling it back. And we found that did change the recordings that we were getting on our automatic temperature recorders, that the low nighttime temperatures were 4 or 5 degrees warmer than they would have been without this reflective layer. But we didn't notice any improvement in the speed of harvest or in the quality of harvest. And that was good because that was a lot of work to do and a lot of effort. So it got me thinking, and the way I think now, that the best way to run the winter harvest is as minimalistic as you can, because then you have enough time to get all the rest of the work done. And it's just one simple layer of fabric inside the greenhouse and the greenhouse itself. We also experimented with air inflating one of our greenhouses. And again, it was 4 or 5 degrees warmer at night, but it made no difference in the crops. What it did make a difference for, though, in a single layer of plastic, you get a lot of frost on the inside of the plastic because there's so much moisture inside the greenhouse on a cold night. And that takes sometimes until about 10, 30, maybe 11 before that melts off to let plenty of sun in. In the air-inflated, double-heated greenhouse, you didn't get that. And so you got the sun in a little earlier. And that did make a difference because it's sun in the winter when the days are short that you want. And however, we did come to the conclusion when we judged just how much good that was doing that it wasn't worth the extra expense of another layer of plastic. And so we stuck with single-layer plastic-covered greenhouses and the single layer of fabric inside.
Yeah, so I have to rewind a little bit because when you were sharing the story about bringing those, vegetables in for us to eat, and we were not too enthusiastic, my memory was actually you were all on this kick to do like bitter greens. And there was one called Sugarloaf, or it was Radicchio. And I remember you'd be so excited and you bring these in and, we'd take one bite of them and we would just be like, ugh, like that's bitter. Like Radicchio for me became ridiculous. Like we don't want any of the ridiculous anymore. But for me as a kid, I remember the moment, though, where I was completely sold was when you would dig up the carrots and you'd bring these carrots in and they had become so sweet and delicious. And we'd just take one bite of them. And it was just this instant sort of, smile and glow. And, we were hooked for life.
Well, I remember when we were in Vermont and you would come home on the school bus and some of your friends would get off at our same stop. And you'd say, well, what do you want to do? Let's go play. And they said, no, let's go out to your dad's greenhouse and get some carrots. So even other people were impressed by that. But what happened in the trials where you found it all bitter, it turned out that certain of the chicory family, even though they remained attractive and made it through the cold, it had an effect on them that intensified their bitterness to the point, and I forget which were the worst offenders, but we would have put on a salad dressing. And if there were a few leaves of that, the oil in the salad dressing would pick the bitter up from those leaves, and it would go through the whole salad. So there were some times when we had tried things that culinarily were not a success, but the rest of it was a great success.
Yeah, no. And I love to, listening to you sort of give a brief kind of synopsis over a pretty good chunk of time. I love how thinking about when you and my mom were first doing this, as you said, it was more about survival. So it was more about like, we don't have a choice, if we don't have electricity, we don't have, easy ways to store things. What can we do to supplement, the green products? So it was like, let's try this. This is about survival. This is about getting fresh greens. And then as years moved on, once you had the opportunity to try to experiment with it, with, having grant money, and how it sort of shifted into more of like how you could really push it and see what was possible. And then to the point of how it could shift into a commercial venture.
And that was the really important part, because there are a lot of things that a home gardener can do that make no sense commercially. So we were definitely focused on, okay, this is really a cool idea, but can we make a living applying this in the market garden? Yeah.
And so what year was that in Massachusetts that you said you sort of had those first, aha moments with the cold frames? And was that in the early, very early 80s? Is that right?
Let's see. No, that was 70...
79.
78, 79.
That's right.
When I was down there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that I'm just trying to place, the chronology. So then from there, moving to Vermont to the mountain school, then you were producing for the school kids, right? For the kitchens. So you had a little bit more of flexibility to play around with stuff as well, because it wasn't you had to sell it at a farmer's market or something, right?
It was the experimental farmer's dream.
Yes.
Because I was supposed to involve 45 students in farming. And so I would think up all sorts of trials. Well, what if we did X, Y, and Z? Mm-hmm. And we could do X, Y, and Z, and then different students would be in charge of harvesting and evaluating those different parts of it. No, that was great fun.
Yeah, no, and it seemed like it gave you also more of that opportunity to experiment without feeling like it had to be all about the numbers and, crunching the numbers.
Well, the nice thing about a farm at a school is that your market is built in. Mm-hmm. So even the failures, which might be hard to sell in an open market, can usually be incorporated into the diet in some effective way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. Do you have any memories of students in sort of their, I guess, awe of eating something in the middle of January, as something they would have guessed, especially back in the 80s?
Well, yes. The thing was, though, what got them was they had actually participated in growing this. Mm. And for a lot of 16, 17-year-olds, that's something they'd never done before. Yeah. But they would remember they had planted these radish seeds. They'd cultivated them. And then they got to harvest them and bring them into the cook in the kitchen, and they were served that night. And that was that sort of stuff is satisfying to me today.
Yes.
To harvest stuff and get it to my customers.
Yeah. So then fast forward to when you returned back to Maine, to the land that you first farmed with my mom in the late 60s. Then you met my stepmother, Barbara, and sort of what was the shift there? Did you do some experimentation first to kind of get back into how you could make this a commercial venture? What was the first few years there in four-season farming for you? Yeah, we did some trials with movable greenhouses and winter. And again, there's slides in some of my winter slideshows where I show the difference between cold frames outdoors after a blizzard and there's 2 feet of snow on them, and cold frames inside a small greenhouse where the snow's on the greenhouse and you can get it off with a lot less work. And that was when we came to the conclusion that we had to find a less work-intensive inner layer. And the floating covers are not as protective as the glass cold frames were, but they work perfectly, and they're self-venting, and they're easier to put on and off and don't require any of the work that the cold frames did. Yeah. So at around that time, I believe you and Barbara took a tour along, we called it your 44th parallel tour. So the 44th parallel is the latitude where this farm is located. And then you looked on a map to see where does it go around the world. And you went to France, I believe. So tell me more about that experience.
Well, we were curious as we had more and more success doing this, especially since a lot of the books that were giving us ideas had been written in Europe. And the Dutch system, the Dutch lights in Holland that I mentioned, that's happening up on the 54th parallel.
Wow.
With a lot less light than we have. But thanks to the Gulf Stream, they have the mild climate. But we were just curious what was going on on our latitude, because that was the same day length.
Mm-hmm.
And we flew into Paris and then drove south until we found a place where the 44th parallel, according to the map, came out of the Atlantic Ocean. And then we just started going east from there. And we learned so much. Whenever we'd see a community garden, we'd just stop. We both speak reasonable French, so we could talk to people. And ask the gardeners, whether this worked or that worked. And they all understood that even though they had a milder climate, day length was in charge. Mm. And day length is the reason why, if I have spinach growing on the 1st of November here and harvest spinach, if I put seeds in the ground that same day, I won't get spinach for about 2 months, because once the day length gets down to 10 hours, which it does here at about that point, growth slows down for new seeds. For a plant like the spinach I just harvested, which was planted back in September, which has a good root system, if you give it enough climate protection of the greenhouse and the inner layer, it'll keep producing spinach leaves all winter. The new seeds in the ground take forever. And so this was, again, an eye-opener. Oh, okay, so it's just not just cold that we're working on, but we're working with very, very short days. And that's how we learned, and we finally put together data on all the different crops, on how long before the 10-hour day each one had to be sown to have enough roots established and to be at a productive stage in its growth. And all the people who have sown spinach in their home garden in the spring and realize how quickly it goes to seed, well, when the days are getting shorter, the spinach keeps sending out new leaves because it's frustrated and can't go to seed. And the days are getting shorter still from November on. And so, boy, that turned out to be the money-making crop of all of them. That was probably the most productive. But it was the crop that attracted you as a little kid, the carrots, that actually made the winter business. Because if you leave carrots in the ground with all their roots and then slide a greenhouse over them, storing them in the cold ground, they get so sweet. And whether the sweetness comes from the fact that the bitter flavors are less intensive or the sugars have increased, I've never found truly good scientific data on which one of those is in charge. But those became candy carrots in our markets, and that brought in the clientele in hordes.
Yeah, and it's still a relatively unique crop for a lot of farmers because of the necessity of needing a movable greenhouse. So I find it interesting that a lot of farmers don't really realize how special that is, because you have to plant the crop in August outside of a greenhouse and then move a greenhouse over it, at least to be able to have it as a commercial venture. Yeah, you could easily do it as a home venture.
But what's especially important is when you move the greenhouse over it, because we have had experience both with kale that we were going to winter over and carrots. If we moved the greenhouse too soon, just because we had no other use for it, what the heck, let's put it over the carrots or the kale. And in these situations, we had an interesting trial because we had both carrots and kale outdoors that we were going to keep harvesting as late as we could. Putting the greenhouse over both of those crops adds a new stress to them that they hadn't experienced. And when crops are stressed, they become more susceptible to insects. And in both those two crops, where we put the greenhouse over the carrots too soon and over the kale too soon, all of a sudden, the kale in the greenhouse had little green worms on it because the white butterflies were still around and they could fly in and lay their eggs, even though the kale outdoors was perfectly healthy and resistant. And the same with the carrots. All of a sudden, in the middle of the winter, when we were harvesting those carrots we had covered too early, we had root maggots, which we didn't have in the... So all the things you can learn just by stepping outside your normal pattern and keeping your eyes open when it goes differently. Yeah,
well, I remember, so the farm that I had in Colorado back in the late 2000s, I had a couple movable greenhouses, and one was dedicated to carrots. But I remember we were at the 38th parallel, so we had a little bit more leeway with planting dates, but then it would suddenly just get cold quickly. So we were always rushing to move 3 greenhouses, and it was always happened to be right around Halloween.
Yep.
So we were trying to push, that as long as possible, so we didn't cover the carrots too early. But we also had crops in the greenhouses, so we didn't want to do that too early either. But I always remember just this mad rush to quickly move 3 greenhouses over those crops, and then bam, we'd get a snowstorm like that next day. So what I find is interesting is this, like, there's no real room for error, a lot of error in this game, because, you miss something up with timing, you don't have another shot, or, the weather comes at you. So I'm wondering, like, what are your experiences with that? Where have you struggled with figuring that out?
Well, the difference is that in the spring, if you plant a seed and something happens and the crop doesn't come up, you replant it 10 days later and it's fine. But where you're planting in the fall, where everything's going backwards, the days are getting shorter and the temperatures are getting cooler, you don't have that flexibility. So we learned quickly, if the carrots you're planting the 15th of October, they're going to be covered by a greenhouse. Something goes wrong, somebody didn't turn on the irrigation and they don't... Boy, you have to be right there instantly to replant if you have a hope of continuing to get a crop.
You meant the 15th of August?
No, the 15th of August.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Because that's our cutoff here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you're out of luck at that point.
Right. Although I've talked to Jack Algier, who grows all sorts of tiny little carrots for Dan Barber down at the Stone Barn Center. And since Jack has a heated greenhouse, he isn't constrained by both cold and day length, just by day length. And so he can actually plant on into third week in September to get later small carrots for Dan, and maybe even later than that.
Yeah, and not to mention he wants tiny, tiny little carrots because it's a restaurant that wants like the baby, micro baby products. So he has an advantage there. That's the timing is really an interesting conundrum, and I've found that that's been one of the most challenging learning curves, is trying to balance the timing with the environmental factors that you can't always control, because obviously with climate change and, things are warmer. So if we have warmer days, even though the light will never change, things seem to be, growing faster.
Oh, yeah.
So it's interesting to figure out how we all can modify and, adjust to that.
The one that you always have to pay attention to, though, is the 10-hour day. And that really seems to rule the winter harvest.
Yeah.
And so you have to have your timing just right. And there was a list put out by a British vegetable growers magazine on how to be able to harvest heads of butterhead lettuce every day all winter. And the planting schedule had you in September doing your sowings like a day and a quarter, a day and a half apart in order to have them come out eventually a week apart in January and February. It was amazing the subtleties of that.
Yeah. And we do something similar here at Four Seasons Farm with Salanova, with the lettuce. So when I first moved back here in 2016, you showed up and you gave me this calendar that had all these dates. It was 2 to 3 days starting in about mid-September of sowings of Salanova in our little soil blocks. And then we transplanted out usually 3 to 4 weeks later. But it was so, precise of the 2 to 3 days. And then that meant we would have, a section to harvest each week based on that sowing date.
Yeah. So once you get that written down, stick with it because it works.
Hey, podcast listeners, we're going to pause for a moment to hear from one of our show sponsors. Today's show is also brought to you by Tunnel Vision Hoops. Tunnel Vision Hoops designs and manufactures do-it-yourself high tunnels, hoop houses, and greenhouses. With an extensive array of products to help large and small growers become more productive, they have 11 different tunnel widths to fit any application and designs to stand up to weather conditions from coast to coast. Tunnel Vision is also a national distributor of parts and accessories needed to build, maintain, or upgrade an existing tunnel or hoop house. Check out their Tunnel Vision Hoops YouTube channel for instructional how-to videos to help build a great high tunnel or hoop house. Here at Four Seasons Farm, we have 2 movable high tunnels made by Tunnel Vision Hoops, and they are definitely my favorites. To learn more, visit their website at tunnelvisionhoops.com. Now, back to the show. Yeah, and then, I know for us, having the reliability of the weekly harvest of that product is huge because otherwise it's kind of a feast or famine approach. You suddenly get a big harvest, 1 week, and then you don't have anything for quite some time after that.
I remember when a neighboring farmer built a greenhouse and thought they were going to get into competition with us.
Yeah.
And that was the one time the co-op said, no, we don't need anything this week. And I said, oh, what's that? And they said, well, we're getting it all from so-and-so's farm. And then the following week, they said, Elliot, we need your stuff again. And I said, what happened? They said, well, they didn't understand timing. Yeah. They planted it all at once, and they didn't understand that you had to be doing it bit by bit over time.
Yeah, and then not only is that timing for, fresh crops important, but then the other side of that is, say, the carrots or the leeks, the things that have already grown to their maturity, and you're protecting them in the greenhouse. And then you have to harvest them each week, but you have to make sure that you're rationing what you harvest week to week so that you don't run out all of a sudden.
Yes.
So that's another interesting, sort of.
No, it's the commercial consideration that the home gardener wouldn't have.
Yes.
Because unless you can guarantee your commercial clients that you're going to be there with the same crop consistently week after week, they might as well get it from California. And the whole idea with the winter harvest in New England is to put the Californians out of business. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So again, I'm really curious about some of the early, failures or struggles that, maybe you and Barbara ran into with trying all this out. Like where did you have an expectation that we weren't able to meet? What was the growing pains for you?
We had our fudge factors.
Okay.
And the best fudge factor was Claytonia. And when we started, we were making a baby leaf salad. And it had baby spinach and baby lettuce, and it had minutina and a frizzy green endive and all these baby leaves in it. But there were times because we might have made a mistake, or the weather was wrong, or it got a little too cold for one of the ingredients before we realized that was a problem. When we would have up to 50% Claytonia in our salad mix. And we loved Claytonia because it was heavy.
Yes.
And so we would be harvesting the 7 or 8 different varieties in that mix. And it was so popular. It was one of the best things we'd ever done. But we'd say, okay, we need 120 pounds for tomorrow. What are we going to do? We just go out and harvest more Claytonia because it was the salvation.
Yeah. And then I love your story about the green mosh. Will you talk about the disadvantage of mosh?
Yeah. Well, beside, I had a rock climbing buddy, and when we were putting the supplies together to go on a trip, I'd be wondering, should we take that with us? And he'd always say, oh, don't weigh no more than a fly turd. We can take that. But the trouble with mosh, it don't weigh nothing. And it's only a single harvest.
Yes.
And it was beautiful. People loved it in there. And yet we took it out because it wasn't as productive per square foot as the other things. And the other crop we played around with, and this is in a minimally heated greenhouse, was watercress. And we had little misters over the watercress beds in the winter. And I think the watercress thought the light filtering through the plastic was a little light filtering through water. So it grew well. And we would put that into the salad as one of the many ingredients, and the customers loved it until we realized that the price for watercress in the supermarket was 4 times what we were getting for it in the salad mix.
Yeah.
So then we took it out and started selling it on its own.
Yeah.
But these were sort of little things you learn economically about what you're doing.
Yeah. And then it's also interesting, too, when you start off, you had this probably incredibly diverse salad mix, but over the years, you've realized that maybe just focusing on individual crops rather than having a huge abundant mix makes more sense because it takes less time.
Yes.
Didn't you have something called the Pac-Man that you designed to spin and mix the greens?
Yeah, we would wash them separately.
Yep.
And we did that because your eye could more easily spot a bad leaf if all the leaves were the same that you were washing or drying.
Yeah.
And then we would dump them into this huge slatted barrel we made, and then close it down and turn a handle, and it would gently give us the mixed salad. It was a great tool. But about the time you came back here, we were already thinking that if we just did 4 different leaves of Salanova, and we'd have the colors and the textures, it would simplify our life incredibly. And for the most part, the customers have been just as happy. I mean, there are still a few of the old customers saying, where's the Claytonia or where's the Minutina? But we explained to them that we've tried to be
more of a business now.
More practical and less spectacular.
Yeah. No, and that's a hard balance. And I think for a lot of farmers, that is a balance to the economics versus the pleasure and, desirability of what you're doing. So I know a lot of farmers struggle with that. So what, I know that one of the challenges can be the harvesting. And I think you have some good stories about freezing your fingers off, trying to harvest. What are some of the tricks that you learned over the years of how to harvest in the middle of January? Yeah,
well, having been an enthusiastic whitewater kayaker in my youth, I had all these kayak gloves, which were pretty thin and yet with just enough insulation so you could hold the paddle and have control. And I started out with them, but once you got into the middle of the winter and wanting to get these baby leaves, it turned out that even the thinnest gloves were awkward. And so we just got in the habit of putting a glove on the knife hand because that was the one you didn't have to worry about. And then when we filled the bucket, take it into the greenhouse or the washing and packing area and soak your hand in warm water for 10 minutes before you went back out to do the next crop. And that worked fairly well. But there were cold days. You had to want to do this, but I think wanting to do this is really the secret to farming in general, because this is hard work. And the world we live in today almost looks down on people who do hard work as if we're somehow oddballs. And we are oddballs. But unless you have gotten the satisfaction that comes from doing this sort of work, you have no idea how spectacular it can be.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the wash pack greenhouse combo that you came up with, because it is definitely unique, and I think it's a great use of space. It's also allowed you to minimally heat some of those greens. So, combining the wash pack within the heat, minimally heated greenhouse. Tell me how that came about.
We started out by wanting to have a work area at one end of our 100-foot by 36-foot. That was our largest greenhouse. And we were also going to raise seedlings on it. So when we poured this concrete floor, we put water pipes in. And we could pump warm water through it, so we could raise seedlings on there in the spring. And it turned out that since the rest of the greenhouse had been growing salad greens all winter, it wasn't the best place to grow seedlings because there were enough aphids around. So we stopped doing that, but we were using this then for a wash and pack area. And we brought in the sinks. We built a walk-in cooler, one place where we didn't turn on the heat pipes and things like that. And that was 1/4 of the greenhouse, and the other 3/4 was in winter crops. The winter crops that did better, something like midwinter arugula, if it didn't get frozen, or even midwinter radishes. They are so good in February, you can't believe it. And so we had to heat the wash and pack area and keep it just above freezing. And we almost didn't notice that it cost a little bit more to keep the rest of the big greenhouse above freezing because we had to do it for the end where we were washing and packing. And if you think what it would have cost us to build a separate wash and pack building, I mean, just a single covered greenhouse with a pipe frame is the least expensive covered space you can build. Yeah. It's like $2 a square foot space. What the heck else can you build for $2 a square foot? Now, the greenhouse where we wash and pack, it is double covered, so we had a little extra expense there, and has roof vents and everything. But still, it turned out to be a delightful place. So it's the middle of winter, and it's a sunny day. So the fact that we only keep it just 35 degrees at night is no longer important because it's heated up to 65, 70 degrees. And you're in there washing and packing vegetables in your T-shirt on a beautiful sunny day. This was pretty nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it transforms the process, and it makes you appreciate, winter more because you actually get to be in the sun and doing the work.
Yep.
And it's great because I mean, were you inspired by anyone in particular when you came up with that? Had you seen this on any other farm, or was this just something that you just kind of figured out?
Yeah.
Because I think it's so cool because a lot of either employees that have worked here and have gone off to start their own farms have replicated it. So Vera and Gordon, for instance, at 10 Mothers Farm, have created their own version, and they've done it in North Carolina.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting because it's a lot warmer down there. And I've also noticed, just since I moved back in 2016, that I've had to put an inner shade cloth layer over the wash pack area because the sun has become that much more intense and difficult to use that space without it getting too hot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think what motivated me was when I realized that because that greenhouse was sharing space with vegetables and seedlings, that the seedlings were not a good idea in there, that I had all this concrete floor. What am I going to use this for? Well, let's,
mother of invention, right?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's really interesting because a lot of people are curious, how do they justify either, the heating cost, both economically, environmentally. So if you can have a space that is multi-useful in that way, you already would have to be heating a wash pack space if it was a separate building.
And you'd have to build it.
But then you might as well take advantage of that residual heat by keeping your crops,
Exactly.
So.
And it was a similar situation when we had our laying hens all winter in a movable greenhouse that we just moved 10 feet down a field all winter.
Yes.
That greenhouse was paid for by the fact that we grew tomatoes in it during the summer. And so if every time I thought about the fact, well, I would have had to have built an incredible chicken house to winter these guys over. And this is free because it's being paid by the tomatoes that are here in the summer. Yeah. Anytime you can do that sort of multiple use structure.
And that it rings true for the movable greenhouses too, because you're able to maximize your growing space by having that movability. So it's the same thing. If you've got incredible soil in one area and you're moving it to the new plot, you have all the timing issues are dealt with. I mean, it's a really slick system.
Now, the one time I decided not to follow up on that economically was when we realized that putting heat into a greenhouse, we got 3 times as many crops in the winter as we did in an unheated greenhouse. And however, what I loved about the winter harvest was what you could do without burning fossil fuels. So I resisted the economic temptation because if you think about it, if you can actually only get twice as many crops in the winter, putting in heat saves you from building another greenhouse and costs a heck of a lot. Yeah. So these were things, and I don't want to think anybody to think I'm encouraging them to put in heat, because I'm not. Because what has been most satisfying about the winter harvest is what we can do without that use of resources.
No, that's so true. And I definitely hear a lot of farmers sort of, struggling with that balance again, how to balance the economics and, the not wanting to have to burn propane. So, well, what, I guess, what has it been like for you to farm with family?
Oh, well, you're not bad family to farm with, Clara. You got pretty good at this when you were out in Colorado. So it wasn't like I had to train up a newbie. You are very organized. So the day-to-day fact that this is a more complicated way to farm than just farming in the summer is something that you seem perfectly comfortable with managing.
I mean, because it's not just me, but you farm, with Barbara, with a partner. I mean, where do you see that as an advantage? Where do you see that as a difficulty? No. Because obviously, doing anything with family, especially a business, is challenging.
But Barbara and I used to have the best time because when we started, we had no employees at all. This was just us, and the rule was once it got to be 8:00. We'd turn off the soft rock and turn on hard rock. And that's what got us through to 11:30 when we were finally finishing up the harvest and washing. And but it was great. It was a challenge. And, an awful lot of people out there think life should be devoid of challenges. You take out the challenges and there's no fun to be had. And it also, if there's a challenge like that, motivates you to think, oh, well, if we did X before Y. And so we paid attention to how long it took to fill the sink with warm water between washing one type of green and the next type of green. And the following day, I was at the local hardware store buying larger pipe so we could get the water in there faster. And that was, all of a sudden, we weren't getting home at 11:30. We'd get home at 11 because we'd saved a half hour somewhere. And those sort of motivations to make your system more efficient are always important.
Yeah, and especially because you're working with your partner or with your family, and you're also maybe living with them. So you want to be able to enjoy the downtime and not feel like it's just about the work.
Yes.
So,
but you also have to realize that both of you are doing it, and you can't slack off because the other person isn't slacking off. So if both of you decide to slack off, that's cool. But you have to realize you have a responsibility to be part of a team in a situation like that.
That just reminded me, I remember one time you came out to visit my farm that I had in Colorado. And I believe we were getting some spinach for dinner. So we went out to harvest spinach. And I seem to recall, because we've always had this competitive streak in our family, we started racing each other, harvesting spinach. And we were sort of looking back to see who had gotten more in their bucket. And it was sort of interesting.
When we had our first employee, she was very competitive too. And we'd be out harvesting spinach in the winter greenhouse. And then we'd go back to the washing packing area. And we'd both quickly weigh our buckets to see who had won.
Right. No, it's good. I used to have a thing with the employees where we'd be bagging Salanova, and you have to get 0.33, and so whoever would fill the bag and put it on the scale and it would be 0.33 right on the nose, we'd each get a point. And so who would get
this is great
more points by the end of the evening. So yeah, no, it's good. You've got to, I think that's one of the things I've always appreciated about you as both as a father and as a farmer, is that you've always made this fun. And, that I think that's important. Like when you talk about the hard work aspect of it, you need to have hard work to also feel fun.
When I first moved here and I was clearing this farm from spruce fir forest, and a neighbor came by, and I think I was probably chopping the roots on a stump trying to get it so I could pry it out and make the field bigger. And he looked over at me, and in his Maine accent, he said, "By golly, Elliot, isn't that an awful lot of work?" And I said, "Well, Berwin, if you knew what I used to do for fun, you wouldn't say that." He said, "What do you used to do for fun?" And I said, "Well, I used to go on mountaineering expeditions. And, I'd have a 75-pound pack on my back all day, cutting steps in a vertical ice cliff so I could pack supplies to Camp 4. And then I got to eat freeze-dried food for the next 2 weeks. And I said, compared to that, this is pretty easy."
Good. I like that. Well, good. Well, I think it's time to launch into the lightning round questions. So this has been a fun tradition that I started. And we've got about 10 questions here, some that are light, some that are a little heavier. So are you ready to get started?
I'm ready. Shoot.
Okay. First question. Your favorite crop to grow, cook, or eat?
Well, the favorite crop to eat and grow has to be our candy carrots. And we started out with just general carrots and then found which of them were the sweetest. And then for a while there, we settled on Napoli from Johnny's. And even though we were growing mokum for our summer carrots because it was sweeter than other summer carrots, but then we realized we could actually do mokum year-round, which is what we do now. If there are those of you who prefer not to grow hybrids, Stokes Seeds years ago used to sell a baby carrot called Corliss Amsterdam, which is an OP, which might also work in that system.
Mm. Oh, no. What about to eat, though?
Oh, that's my favorite snack.
Oh, sorry. To cook. Sorry.
Well, I never usually cook these things because they're so sweet.
Do you have a favorite crop to cook, though?
A favorite crop to cook is probably artichokes.
Ah.
And we jokingly refer to ourselves as Maine's largest artichoke farm. We're also probably one of Maine's few artichoke farms.
Okay, next question. What gets you up in the morning?
Anticipation of how much fun I'm going to have during the day.
Good answer. Number 3, hardest part of farming.
Yeah, getting people to understand the importance of having local farmers. Not only it was quite obvious what happened during COVID, everybody realized, oh, yeah, if my food isn't coming from right next door, there might not be any. That's important. But just having someone growing your food who cares enough about it to be wanting to make it as nutritious for you as possible.
Yeah. Mm. What's your favorite tool?
Oh, at the moment, it's my wire hoe with the exchangeable blades on there.
Talk about that, how you came up with that tool.
Yeah, I was talking to, what's his name? Michael Fitzpatrick at a conference. And he said his favorite tool in the greenhouse was this little thing that Johnny sold, which had a plastic thing and had little wires at each end. And I said, come on, that's a toy. That's a home gardener's toy. And he said, yeah, he loved it. And so I got to thinking about it. And I just went home and put a piece of wire into the vise and bent it around and made one that fit on the end of a handle. And then I decided the easiest way to do it is to drill a hole vertically through a 1/2-inch bolt, put the 2 1/8-inch ends of the wire in there and braze it, and then weld a 1/2-inch nut onto the end of the hoe ferrule. And then I could have 3 or 4 different sizes with me. And the most recent improvement is to make the wire part out of square wire. You can buy square 1/8-inch wire, and it makes it just that little bit more aggressive on a hard soil than the round wire. But it was also the lightest hoe, and it was so nice to be able to have these hoes on on my belt so I could change sizes. And Connor copied this, and people have told me, oh, but his click-on is so much better than your thread-in. And I said, wait a minute. If I've been cultivating for an hour and I get to stand up, relax, and take an extra 10 seconds to thread on the new hoe size, I consider that a bonus.
Good point. And this is a tool that you've found is incredibly useful for that early cultivation of crops to remove thread stage weeds and basically all that weeding that we all would love to think that we can do, frequently and regularly early on, but rarely do we have time to do.
Right. And Peter Henderson, who wrote one of the best market gardening books back in the 18th or 19th century, has a line in his book that he said, one worker can do more cultivating in a day if the weeds are thread stage than a crew of 20 can do if you let them get bigger. And
yes,
that's the key to cultivating.
Yes.
And I tell people it's like the old joke about voting in Chicago. Do it early and often.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's such a hard balancing act, I have to admit. I mean, I understand the philosophy, but the amount of tasks that you have to do in June when you also need to be weeding is so overwhelming. So it's really challenging. And I think for me, it's trying to to that time management, how to crack that nut.
Yeah, and it's probably worth it. It may be hard to find this person, but pay a little more to bring in somebody for 2 weeks there when you need them, and just focus them on that, and it'll save you so much work later on.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, next question. What is your favorite music that you listen to while farming?
Oh, I'm one of those few farmers without earphones on. I'm listening to the birds and the sounds of nature. That's why that's why I like being outside and working outside.
If you were to turn music on, what would you typically listen to?
Oh, yeah, the music from my youth. Yeah, we had great music back then. I mean, I go back as far as Bill Haley and the Comets. I'm a real old guy, but yeah.
What do you love besides farming?
Reading. I've put together an excellent library, not just on farming, but mainly on farming. But I'm fascinated by how someone who is no longer alive can still communicate with me because they put their ideas down and they're on paper, and I'm a addict of used bookstores, and I can get a hold of that book and commune with this person.
Now, the sort of the tactile feeling of holding a book, is that something that's so ingrained in you that you'll never be able to let that go now that we have digital access to things?
I can't read on Kindle.
No.
Yeah, I like books.
Yeah.
And the other thing, that's why I've put together a good library. I look upon my ag library as the equivalent of the monasteries in the Middle Ages that kept civilized ideas alive only because they were the last repositories of books.
Yeah.
And so in today's world, when the last bits and bytes and diddly-wo disappear, the library in my study will be like a medieval monastery.
How many titles do you think you've collected over the years?
Oh, I think I have about 3,000 books in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially the ones on farming. There have been so many intelligent farmers, and this requires a lot of thinking to do well, especially the organic part. And some of these books are just absolutely delightful.
I love how you've described a lot of them as your agricultural grandparents.
Oh, they are. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
I think that's a great analogy. Who is an inspiring farmer or land steward you'd want to have as a dinner guest, either living or deceased?
Oh, well, that's one of my agricultural grandparents. There was a British grasslands expert, and his name was Sir George Stapleton, and he ran a grasslands research place, and he wrote a number of books, one on human ecology, and he was the one who was most behind pushing the concept of what in England is called ley farming, L-E-Y. And ley is an old Anglo-Saxon word for a temporary pasture. And the thing was about ley farming, which is also called alternate husbandry, because you alternate between the land being in a multi-species pasture grazed by animals and then tilling it up and growing crops on it for a few years to cash in the carbon that you took and put in the soil. And then you put it back into pasture to capture more carbon again. And of all the systems, this is the only one that I know of that is a permanent system of permanent fertility forever and ever. And his book on ley farming is just absolutely exciting to read.
And so he's deceased, so he'd be your dinner guest.
I would be delighted to have Sir George for dinner. Yes.
What would be your one question to ask him?
Oh, dear. I would probably want to know if he thought that ley farming had been adopted at the time he was pushing it as thoroughly as it could have been, because back then I don't think people were quite as aware as we are of the need for perpetual systems. And to me, it is the perpetual fertility system.
What is your learning edge? And where do you feel like your abilities or understanding as a farmer could grow?
Oh, they could grow everywhere. That's what's so much fun about this, that there are so many different aspects to it. I mean, I could spend a long time studying photosynthesis, and other time studying mycorrhizal association and everything. It just, this is the most multi-part business that anybody could be in. And there's lots of little improvements you could make. And I used to talk about 1%ers. And something I do might only make a 1% improvement in my yield or quality. But I claim that these things are cumulative. So if I can work on 10 of them, now we're talking about serious improvements.
Yeah, and over, 53 plus years too,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
How do you relate to that which is out of your control?
Oh, well, I don't enjoy it, and I spend a lot of time figuring out how to get it back into control. I love a quote from Amory Lovins, and he was saying, I don't do problems, I do solutions. And there is going to be a solution to getting things back into control. And it's going to be focusing on not making the same mistake that you made that allowed it to get out of control. And, there's times when you can't do anything about that because there is a huge windstorm and it rips the plastic off the greenhouse. And yeah, then you got a little bit of work to do.
What do you long for, and how does that influence how you farm?
Oh, what do I? Well, I long for greater enlightenment, I guess. I long for everybody to be as well fed as we are, because it is really easy. I mean, I try and explain to people that the thing that organic farming did is it put food production back into the hands of the people. And if you go back to the 1940s, food production, it was this huge industrial thing. And you had to buy their fertilizers and their pesticides and their herbicides. And it had been totally taken away from human beings. And once you realize that organic farming makes it possible for anybody with a hoe, a rake, and a small piece of ground to feed themselves. And I tell people there's 3 parts to this. The first is compost. The world's best fertilizer is made for free in your backyard from waste products. The second is add to that something as simple as crop rotation. You don't have to buy crop rotation. It's something coming out of your head. It's a management practice that makes everything work better together. And the third part of it is open pollinated seeds. So some nasty seed company can't deny you the seed because open pollinated seeds are part of the what belongs to everybody. And this is, I think, nobody ever credits organic farming with having put food into everybody's hands and the ability to feed themselves, which is what it did.
Mm. And lastly, how will you grow old farming?
Well, I'll never stop farming. I kid that my idea of the last moment of my life is I keel over out in the garden picking a bunch of carrots to take in for dinner, basically.
No.
I'm still having fun working with the planet. And when I think about what I've learned about working with the planet, I can't tell you how privileged I feel, because on a daily basis, I get to commune with the secrets of the universe. And that's what's going on out there in nature. That's the secrets of the universe. And I get to work with and try and understand better and associate with the secrets of the universe on a daily basis. And why would I want to stop?
Yeah, if we could all know better the secrets of the universe.
Yeah.
Amen. Well, thank you so very much. This has been such a pleasure and fun. I mean, obviously I farm with you all the time, but rarely do I get a chance to sit down and have, a one-on-one conversation like this. So I so appreciate it. I so appreciate you, everything that you've given me and the farming world. And thank you for taking this time.
You're working too hard. We need to have a little more Miller time, I think.
Well, good. Well, thank you again.
Great, Clara. My pleasure.
Today's show was produced by me, Clara Coleman, with support from No-Till Growers. Special thank you to Willie Breeding for the theme music. Thank you to the patrons at patreon.com/no-till growers for helping to make this show possible.